Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the mountains. Comment on where you're watching from and get ready to learn the dark secrets. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. Any similarity to real people, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina were a whole different world in the last decades of the 1800s. Many people lived far away from the big cities, in communities that were separated by miles of steep trails and thick forests where the morning mist never seemed to go away. Families made their own rules there, and religion mixed with old European superstitions. Secrets could be buried as deep as the roots of oak trees that had been there for hundreds of years. Ward Farm was at the bottom of one of these mountains. The only way to get there was by a dirt road that turned to red mud when it rained in the spring. The property had acres of arable land and was surrounded by pine and fir trees. The main house was made of dark wood and seemed to soak up the sunlight instead of reflecting it. There were a few smaller buildings around it that served as a barn, storage space, and a private chapel that the family built themselves. Joshua Ward was the head of the family. He was a tall man with a gray beard that reached his mid-chest. People would look away when he stared at them for too long because his clear eyes had an unsettling intensity. Joshua was from Virginia and had come to those mountains decades earlier, saying that he had received a divine vision that had led him to that exact spot. He told the few travelers who passed through the area that God had chosen that land for him to build a community of true believers, far away from the corruption of the cities and churches that he said had strayed from the sacred path. His wife, Martha Ward, didn't smile much and prayed a lot. She always wore dark clothes and had her hair in a tight bun. She moved around the property like a ghost. Her closest neighbors, who lived miles away, didn't see her talk very often. When she did talk, her words were always short and almost whispered, as if she were afraid that someone else might hear her. Martha's eyes showed that she had given up, that she had accepted something she could never say out loud. There were also other family members who lived on the property. Ezekiel and Samuel, two of Joshua's brothers, came to the mountain soon after he did. Both were very religious, but Ezekiel was quieter and would spend whole days working in the fields without saying a word. The youngest of the three brothers, Samuel, was different. He smiled easily, but his eyes didn't light up. When he listened, he tilted his head in a way that made it seem like he was always thinking about something that only he knew. The Blackwells, a middle-aged couple, lived on the farm with Joshua. He called them his first converts. They had come years before to escape debts in Tennessee, and found not only safety in the Ward community but also a new way to worship that required more than just Sunday prayers. Joshua had also taken in 3 unmarried sisters after their parents died in circumstances that were never fully explained. The women worked in the kitchen, took care of the garden, and didn't leave the property very often. Joshua set a strict schedule for the Ward farm that everyone had to follow. The day started with prayers in the chapel that lasted at least an hour. There were Bible readings between work in the fields, and meals were times of complete silence, except for Joshua's voice reading passages from the Bible. After dinner at night, there were more prayers that often went on until the early hours of the morning. Joshua said that sleeping was a waste of time that could be spent talking to God. The few people who came to the farm, usually merchants or lost travelers looking for a place to stay, noticed how strange the place was. There was a lot of stress in the air, as if everyone was always being watched and judged. People were careful when they talked. Smiles were few and far between, and there was always someone nearby, so visitors were never completely alone. Many people who stayed with the Ward family for a night would leave quickly at dawn, taking with them stories of strange chants they heard coming from the forest in the early morning, and how shadows seemed to move in strange ways around the chapel. People in the nearest village, which was about a day's ride away on horseback, knew the Wards but didn't really understand them. They came by every now and then to buy things they couldn't make themselves. They always paid in silver coins that looked too old for the time. Joshua's hands were rough from working hard, and the local blacksmith often said so. He also had strange scars on his wrists that looked like they were done on purpose rather than by accident. The grocer saw that Martha never looked anyone in the eye and kept her eyes on the floor or the shelves. He also saw that her hands shook a little when she paid. Of course, there were rumors. There are always rumors in small, isolated towns. Some people said that the Ward family practiced a kind of Christianity that was close to fanaticism and used strange interpretations of the Bible to justify bad behavior. People talked in whispers about nightly rituals and how the candlelight in the chapel could be seen through the windows in strange patterns. A traveling salesman said he once saw hooded people walking into the woods one at a time, carrying something heavy wrapped in dark cloth. But they were just stories, the kind of things people tell to keep busy on long winter nights. No one knew for sure how many people lived on the Ward farm, which made things even more interesting. The number seemed to change. Joshua sometimes said that he had 8 people living with him in the village, and other times he said that he had 12. And there were times when neighbors who lived far away said they had seen more people working in the fields than Joshua said there were. But who were these people? Where did they come from? And why did they choose to stay in that remote area under the leadership of a man whose religious fervor was greater than that of even the most passionate preachers in the area? The geography of the area added to the mystery. People knew that the Appalachian mountains in that area had deep caves, some of which were never fully explored. The fog was always there, which made rocks look like people and shadows change into shapes that couldn't be real. It was simple to get lost there and vanish. The Ward farm was in one of those places where nature seemed to work against people to keep secrets hidden. The seasons came and went on Ward farm in a way that was very different from the way the people who lived there felt. In the spring of 1894, heavy rains turned the paths into rivers of mud, making the property even more cut off from the rest of the world. It was during these times of complete isolation that the true nature of that community began to show itself, like peeling away the layers of bark on a tree to show the rotten wood inside. During the rainy months, Joshua Ward preached more. He couldn't work in the fields, so he brought everyone on the farm to the chapel from dawn to dusk. His words bounced off the wooden walls as he talked about cleansing, sacrifice, and how the outside world was doomed. He said that only those who followed his specific instructions would be saved. These were not normal sermons. Joshua talked about how he could talk directly to higher powers, how he got messages while he was awake for long periods of time, and how each person on the farm had a specific role in the divine plan that only he could fully understand. During sermons, Martha was almost like a ghost. She sat in the front row, completely still, with her eyes fixed on a point outside the chapel walls. Her lips would move in silent prayers from time to time, but her face didn't show any emotion. The other women on the property looked at her with a mix of respect and maybe fear, but no one ever said anything about it. A new person joined the community that spring when it was hot and humid. Thomas Garrett was a man in his 40s who had lost his family in a fire in Georgia. He wandered around the roads until he ended up in the North Carolina mountains, where he hoped to start over. When Joshua found the Ward farm, he welcomed him with a warmth that was almost excitement, which was unusual for the usually quiet head of the family. Thomas was a carpenter and a blacksmith, which were useful skills, and Joshua started talking right away about the things they could do together and how it was obviously God's will that brought him there. Thomas was thankful in the first few weeks. He had a place to live, food to eat, and a new sense of purpose. But over time, as the days turned into weeks, He started to notice strange things that bothered him. The prayers weren't just long. They were tiring and meant to break down anyone's mental defenses. People felt completely exposed when Joshua looked at them during his sermons, as if he could read and judge every secret thought they had. There were also a lot of rules about everything, from how to eat to how to breathe during prayers. Each one was presented as a commandment from God that could not be questioned. Thomas also saw that no one ever left the property by themselves. Joshua always sent at least 2 people with him when he had to go to the village. One of them was always Ezekiel or Samuel. People were always watching what they said, and any talk that didn't have to do with work or religion was quickly stopped. There was always a sense of being watched, as if eyes were on every move, every facial expression, and every whispered word. Thomas was surprised to see one of the sisters who worked in the kitchen one night while he was alone in the barn fixing a wagon wheel. She walked in quietly, looked around to make sure they were alone, and then hurried over to him with a look of urgency in her eyes. She spoke quickly and in a low voice, so low that it was hard to hear. She talked about how she had come there years before because Joshua had promised her a deeper spiritual life, but she quickly realized that she couldn't leave. She talked about punishments for people who questioned, how the farm's isolation made it impossible to get help from outside, and how fear was the real reason they were all stuck there. The barn door opened, and Samuel stood in the doorway before he could say anything else. His smile was still there, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He casually said that it was too late for conversation, and that everyone should be getting some sleep before the next morning's prayers. The woman quickly pulled back, bowed her head, and left. Samuel stayed for a moment, still smiling, and then said something that made Thomas's blood run cold. He said that loyalty was the most important quality on the farm, and that people who didn't show it fully often found that the world outside the mountains wasn't as friendly as they had thought it would be. The way power worked on the farm was complicated and very hard to see. Joshua was the clear leader, but Ezekiel and Samuel were like his extended arms, each with their own job. Ezekiel was the quiet force, always there, always watching. Just being there reminded everyone that no one was out of sight. Samuel was different. He used psychological manipulation to become a trusted friend to new members, only to later use their confessions against them. This made it even harder to leave because it made them feel guilty and obligated. Meals at the farm were especially revealing of how power worked. Everyone sat at a long wooden table, with Joshua at the end. Everyone had to wait for Joshua to start eating before they could touch their own plates. Food was served in a strict order. Joshua often tested his followers' faith during meals by asking them hard theological questions. If you didn't answer correctly, you didn't get punished right away, but you did get disapproving looks and smaller portions of food at the next meal. It was a sophisticated way to control people's minds. Punishment was often taking away approval and making a vague threat of something worse that was never named but was always in the mind. The chapel itself was a strange place. Joshua had insisted that it be built without windows in the side walls, with only a small hole in the roof that let in a beam of light at certain times of the day. There were hand-painted scriptures on the walls, but they weren't the usual ones from the Bible. Many of the verses were hard to understand, and Joshua used them in ways that helped him. He also mixed in what he called personal revelations. In the middle of the chapel was a simple altar, but Joshua had drawn symbols around it that he said were from ancient times and represented divine protection against evil forces from the outside world. Thomas started to have trouble falling asleep. He shared a small cabin with 2 other men, and it felt cramped. The sounds of the farm at night were also unsettling. In the middle of the night he heard footsteps, voices whispering in the distance and sometimes what sounded like someone crying, but he could never figure out where the sound was coming from. When he talked about these problems during the day, The others just looked away and changed the subject. He had learned that this was a sign that he shouldn't ask certain questions. The start of summer came after spring, and with the drier weather came a new project. During a morning sermon, Joshua said that he had been told to add to the property by building new buildings in the deeper parts of the forest that surrounded it. He talked about making spiritual retreats, which are places where people in the community could spend days alone, fasting and praying until they became more spiritually aware. He talked about these retreats in a way that made them sound scary, even though he carefully chose his words to make them sound like chances for spiritual growth. Work on the building started right away. They put Thomas in charge of the project because he was a good carpenter. As they went deeper into the woods, he saw odd things about the land. There were places where the ground looked like it had been disturbed and then carefully hidden, with unnatural dips in the ground. And at one point he found what looked like the old foundations of buildings that had been there before, even though Joshua had never said anything about buildings that had been there before. The summer heat was so thick that it felt like it made the air heavier and harder to breathe. Cicadas and birds made the forest around the Ward farm come to life. But inside the house, silence was the main sound, broken only by Joshua's increasingly intense preaching and the constant work he made everyone do. Thomas kept building the new buildings in the forest, even though he still wasn't sure what they were for. Joshua went to the site every day and looked at every detail with a critical eye. He made changes to the design that didn't make sense from a structural point of view. He said that certain beams had to be put at certain angles, that doors had to open in certain ways, and that hidden compartments had to be made in the walls. He said these were instructions received in his night visions. Joshua pulled Thomas aside during one of these visits and started to talk with a passion the carpenter had never seen before. The sun was shining through the trees, making patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. He talked about trials and how true faith had to be tested beyond what most people thought was reasonable. He said that the great prophets of the past had gone through things that would break normal people. He said that suffering was the way that God shaped people who were worthy of its special attention. What Joshua said had a hypnotic effect. He would talk for hours, and his voice would rise and fall in ways that sounded like they were rehearsed. He used repetitions and planned pauses that made it hard to keep your thoughts clear and separate. Thomas agreed with ideas that, after thinking about them alone, he realized were very disturbing. When Joshua was around, it was as if reality could be changed. His words could change how people saw what was right or wrong, normal or obvious. Martha went back to the main house and went on with her quiet life. But something was different about her. Her hands shook more clearly now, and sometimes someone would see her standing in the middle of a task, with her eyes glazed over, as if her mind had gone to a faraway dark place that was hard to get back to. The other women on the farm started to take care of her with a gentleness that showed they were worried about her, but also scared that what was happening to Martha could happen to any of them. Ezekiel, the Ward brother who spoke the least, started to take on more duties in charge of the farm on a daily basis. Ezekiel didn't use words as weapons like Joshua did. Instead, he mostly used gestures and looks to talk. Everyone knew that a nod meant yes, a furrowed brow meant no, and his long silence in response to a question was a warning not to push the issue. Ezekiel was more threatening because he didn't have to say anything to make his presence known. On the other hand, Samuel had become more and more involved in the lives of the younger people in the community. He would show up out of the blue, always with that smile that didn't reach his eyes and questions that seemed casual, but were important. He asked people about their dreams, the things they thought about while praying for a long time, and the doubts they might not have said out loud but that he seemed to know about. And then he used this information in later conversations in a way that made people feel exposed and vulnerable. There was something more than just religious about the way things were done on the farm. It was as if the exact repetition of the movements had some hidden meaning, since each activity had to be done at a certain time and in a certain way. The first light of day touched the top of the mountain to the east, and breakfast was served. There were no clocks to tell the time, so lunch happened when the sun was directly overhead, and dinner started right when the shadows of the tallest trees reached the door of the main house. Joshua started a new habit at mealtimes. He started picking a different person from the community every day to stand up during the meal and watch the others eat. People were told it was an honor and a chance to practice not being attached to their bodily needs, but everyone knew it was just another way for the patriarch to control them and remind them that he could deny them even the most basic needs, like eating. Thomas saw that some of the older people in the community acted strangely. A man from the Blackwell family who had been there for years had a nervous tic that made him blink a lot whenever Joshua came into the room. One of the sisters who worked in the kitchen started pulling out her own hair when she thought no one was watching. This left small bald spots that she tried to hide with the scarf she always wore. These were signs that something more than just religious devotion was going on there, something that was slowly driving the people who were stuck there crazy. After weeks of hard work, the building in the woods was finally finished. There were 3 small huts, each big enough for one person to lie down in, arranged in a triangle around a small open space where Joshua put up another rustic altar. The huts had no windows, just small holes near the ceiling for air to flow through. The doors could only be locked from the outside. When Thomas nervously asked about this feature, Joshua said it was to keep people who were on a spiritual retreat from being tempted to leave their solitude before their fasting and prayer time was up. Joshua called everyone together for a special meeting in the chapel the night after the buildings were finished. As he talked about how the community needed to reach a new level of commitment, the candlelight made shadows dance on the walls. He said that over the next few months, each member would spend time in the new retreat buildings, with the amount of time varying based on what he thought was best for each person. He promised that it would change their lives in ways they had never thought possible, bringing them closer to the divine. After that announcement, the mood on the farm changed. There was a real sense of tension in the air, as if something unavoidable was coming. There were fewer and fewer conversations. People didn't want to look each other in the eye, as if doing so would show the fears they all had, but were too scared to say. People worked in the fields, ate their meals at the right times, and prayed all day, but everything seemed to be happening in a haze of rising fear. During one of the morning sermons, Martha fell down without making a sound. She just fell to the side on her pew, aware but unable to move or speak, with her wide eyes fixed on the ceiling of the chapel. Joshua stopped preaching, looked at her for a long time, and then went back to preaching as if nothing had happened. The other women finally carried her out. Their bodies made a sad procession as they took her back to the main house. After the incident, no one said anything about it, and Martha came back to meals as if nothing had happened. Thomas started making plans to leave without saying anything. He knew it wouldn't be easy to leave the Ward farm. It wasn't as simple as just walking down the road. Joshua had built up such a strong web of fear and dependence that even people who wanted to leave felt stuck because they didn't know what they would find outside the property's walls or what Joshua might do if they tried and failed. But Thomas was set on it. He started to save small amounts of food, watch the patterns of the surveillance, and memorize the way through the woods that could take him back to civilization. But the Ward farm had eyes everywhere, and secrets, no matter how well they were kept, had a way of coming out in that place where Joshua could read the minds of his followers. The nights in August were so hot that they made the air at Ward Farm feel even more oppressive. The smell of dry earth and pine trees filled the air, along with the smell of burning candles in the chapel until the early hours of the morning. On these nights, when there was no wind, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing, echoing through the property in ways that didn't make sense. During an evening sermon, Joshua said that it was time to start spiritual retreats. He chose Silas, one of the oldest members of the community, to be the first participant. Silas had come to the farm shortly after the Blackwells. Joshua often used Silas as an example for others because he was known for his quiet devotion and unquestioning obedience. The choice didn't seem random. It was more like a planned show that even the strongest loyalty couldn't protect Joshua from the tests he thought were necessary. The next morning, before dawn, Silas was taken to the buildings in the woods. Joshua, Ezekiel, and Samuel led a small, quiet procession along the trail, which was now easy to see because it was used so much. The rest of the community was told to stay in the main house and pray for Silas's spiritual journey. But they could see the torches moving through the trees and then disappearing completely into the thick green of the woods through the windows. That night and the next night, Silas did not come back. Joshua said that the retreat would last as long as it needed to, and that it would not be up to people to decide when it was over, but rather by divine signs that only he could understand. During this time, the farm's anxiety grew in a way that could almost be felt. People ate in even more silence than usual, and their prayers sounded desperate, as if everyone were trying to convince themselves that what was going on was a spiritual experience and not something much worse. Thomas grew more and more worried as he watched everything. He saw that Martha looked like she had aged years in just a few days, that the other women were even more careful as they moved around the house, and that even Samuel had lost some of his constant smile. It felt like the whole farm was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible but unavoidable to happen. Joshua came back from the forest on the 5th day, alone, in the middle of the afternoon. He looked calm, almost glowing, as he called everyone in the chapel to tell them about Silas's spiritual change. He talked in vague, high-minded ways about the revelations he had received, and how fasting and constant prayer had opened doors of understanding that most people would never be able to reach. His description was both interesting and scary, painting a picture of a mystical experience that seemed to be on the edge of what is normal for people. That same night, Silas was taken back to the farm, but the man who came back was very different from the man who had left. He moved as if he were in a trance, only answering questions with one word. His eyes had a glassy quality that made it seem like part of him was still in that dark, lonely place in the woods. He ate and slept when told to, but he seemed to have lost all of his drive and willpower. Joshua said that Silas's change was a spiritual victory, proof that his methods worked and that it was possible to go beyond the limits of the ego and fully submit to the will of God. But for Thomas and others who weren't blinded by doctrine, it was clear that something much more troubling had happened. Silas hadn't grown spiritually. He had been broken down to a shell of a person who followed orders without thinking critically. The protest had the effect that the community wanted. The fear that was already there became total. Everyone now knew that spiritual retreats were not chances to grow, but rather punishments or ways to control people that were hidden behind religious language. Everyone on the farm knew that it would be their turn eventually, and Joshua would call them one by one to go through the same dark change. Thomas made his plans to escape even more serious. He started writing a story that would give Joshua a good reason to leave the farm that would fit with his goals. He thought about suggesting a trip to the village to get some specific carpentry supplies, or even offering to explore even more remote parts of the mountains to find good places for the community to grow in the future. Any pretext that would give him a few hours away from constant surveillance would be enough to disappear into the mountains and never look back. But Joshua seemed to have an almost magical ability to read people's minds. Maybe it was just careful watching, years of experience manipulating people to the point of knowing all the signs of doubt and discontent. Or maybe it was something else. A heightened ability to notice even the smallest changes in behavior that showed thoughts of rebellion. No matter what the reason, he started to pay special attention to Thomas. He would show up at work without warning, ask questions that seemed casual but were full of innuendo, and watch him with those piercing eyes that seemed to see through all of his defenses and masks. One afternoon, while Thomas was fixing the fence around the pasture by himself, Joshua quietly showed up next to him. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. He just stood there and watched the work, which made Thomas feel more awkward and nervous with every move he made. Finally, Joshua started to talk, but not about religion or spirituality. He talked about loyalty. He told stories about other people who had come to the farm over the years. At first, they seemed dedicated, but later they showed signs of doubt, reservations, and a desire to go back to the corrupt world they had left behind. It was never made clear what would happen to these people, but Joshua's words made it clear what would happen. He talked about how dangerous the mountains could be, how easy it was for someone who didn't know what they were doing to get lost on the confusing trails, and how there were ravines hidden by plants where a wrong step could lead to falls from which there was no way back. He talked about wild animals that still lived in the most remote parts of the forest, like bears and cougars that were sometimes seen nearby. He also talked about how the community was like a family, and how families needed to keep their secrets, stay together, and make sure that no one who disagreed with them could threaten the peace they had built. Thomas got the message loud and clear. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat in disguise. Joshua would not let anyone leave, and anyone who tried would face consequences that Joshua was more than happy to carry out. The patriarch then put a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder and squeezed it with enough force to almost hurt him. He then suggested that maybe it was time for Thomas to go on his own spiritual retreat, which would help him deepen his commitment and get rid of any doubts he might still have. Even though it was hot outside, the words made Thomas's body shiver. He knew that if he let Joshua take him to those buildings in the woods and completely cut him off from everyone else, he might never come back as the same person he was before. He looked into the patriarch's eyes and saw something that confirmed all his worst fears, a complete lack of warmth hidden behind all the religious talk, and a willingness to do whatever it took to keep total control over his small kingdom in the mountains. Thomas didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the narrow bed in the cabin he shared with others and heard the familiar sounds of the farm, but now every noise seemed to be dangerous. Someone outside could be coming to get him. People could be whispering about what will happen to him. The wind made the old wood creak, which sounded like it was warning of what was to come. A thick fog covered the Ward farm like a gray shroud when dawn broke, making it hard to see more than a few meters. It was the kind of morning that seemed perfect for Joshua's needs, with nature working against him to make him feel alone and lost. Thomas woke up with a tense body, every muscle on high alert because his survival instinct told him that time was running out. While praying in the morning, Joshua kept looking at Thomas for a long time. It was a silent message that everyone in the chapel could feel, but no one wanted to talk about. The sermon talked about giving up and making sacrifices, and how the old self had to die for something new to grow. Every sentence seemed to be aimed at the carpenter, and every pause was timed to give the full weight of the meaning time to sink in. After the prayers, while everyone else went about their business, Joshua called Thomas into his office, a small room in the main house that not many people in the community ever went into. There was only a simple table, 2 chairs, and shelves full of old books and diaries where Joshua wrote down what he saw and heard about each person he was in charge of. Joshua didn't waste any time with small talk. He told Thomas that his spiritual retreat would start that very afternoon, that it had already been decided that it would last 7 full days, and that during this time he would only get water and the bare minimum he needed to stay alive. Joshua promised him that it would be a cleansing experience that would get rid of all the doubts and resistance that were still in his heart. It was clear from the way he spoke that he wasn't inviting anyone. He was making a decision that couldn't be changed. Thomas felt panic rise in his throat like bitter bile. He needed time, a way to put off or avoid that fate completely. He tried to keep his voice steady as he said that maybe he could be more helpful by first fixing the barn roof, which needed his special skills and couldn't wait until the autumn rains came. Joshua looked at him for a long time, his clear eyes seeming to take in every word, every small movement, and every involuntary tremor. Then, to everyone's surprise, the patriarch nodded. There would be a concession, a short delay. Thomas had 3 days to finish the necessary repairs. After that, he would go into the forest structures without any more delays or excuses. Ezekiel would work with Thomas during this time to make sure there were no misunderstandings or stupid attempts to escape. He would be a constant shadow, making it impossible for anyone to move around without supervision. For the next 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Thomas worked on the roof in the hot, late summer sun, and every time he hit it with a hammer, it sounded like a countdown. Ezekiel stood below, still as a statue, his eyes never leaving Thomas for more than a few seconds. Thomas was locked inside his cabin at night, listening to footsteps going by on a regular basis outside. This made it impossible for him to think about escaping at night. While eating, Thomas looked at the other people in the community and saw a mix of compassion and relief on their faces. They felt sorry for him because they knew what was going to happen to him. They felt better because it was Thomas's turn and not theirs. Silas still walked among them like a robot, a living example of what spiritual retreats really do to a person. He did what he was told, ate when he was told, but the person he had been before seemed to have been completely erased and replaced by something that only pretended to be human. Martha had become even more withdrawn and spent most of her time alone in her room. Her face was as pale as wax when she did show up, and her eyes didn't look at anyone directly. The other women whispered to each other when they thought they were alone, worried about what the matriarch's mental state might be. But these talks always ended quickly when someone came up, because the fear of being watched all the time made it impossible to have a real conversation about the farm's conditions. Thomas heard noises coming from the forest on the second night while he was lying in bed. There were many voices singing together, but the tune was strange and didn't sound like any hymn he knew. The chanting went on for hours, with the volume going up and down in a way that he couldn't figure out. He could feel the other men in the cabin were awake too. Their bodies were tense and their breathing was irregular, but no one talked about what they were hearing, as if saying the sounds out loud would somehow make them more real and scary. Thomas made a desperate mistake on the last day of repairs. Ezekiel was momentarily distracted by Samuel, who had come to deliver a message. Thomas then quickly ran down from the roof and headed for the barn, saying he needed more nails. Once he was inside, he tried to get to the back door, thinking he could get a few extra minutes before anyone noticed he was gone. But Ezekiel's huge body blocked the way out after only 3 steps. He came out of nowhere, which seemed impossible for someone his size. There were no words. Ezekiel just grabbed Thomas's arm hard enough to leave purple marks and took him back to the roof. But now the surveillance was different. It was more intense, which made it clear that any trust that was left had been completely lost. When Thomas was done working for the day, he wasn't taken back to his cabin. Instead, he was locked in a small shed next to the barn. It was a small, dark, windowless space where he spent the night listening to rats scurrying between the walls and trying not to think about what dawn would bring. The next morning, Joshua showed up in person to say that the grace period was over. There would be no breakfast, no group prayers, and no more delays. They would take Thomas right away to the woods. Joshua's voice was cold, not the fake religious friendliness he usually used. It was the voice of someone who had made up their mind and would not put up with any more resistance. There was no talking at all on the way to the buildings in the woods. Joshua was in front, then Thomas, and finally Ezekiel and Samuel. The path still had some of the morning mist on it, which made it look like a dream. Thomas tried to remember every detail of the trail, every striking tree, and every turn in the path. He was desperate to find a way to escape, even though he had been taken to a remote area. Thomas's stomach tightened when they got to the 3 cabins that were set up in a triangle. The structures looked even scarier than when he built them, thanks to the light coming through the trees. The dark wood walls seemed to soak up the light, and the small vents near the low ceilings looked like empty eyes watching him come in. Since the last time Thomas had been there, more symbols had been added to the altar in the middle of the open space. These were markings he didn't recognize, and looked like they had been painted with something darker and thicker than regular paint. Joshua opened the door to one of the cabins and told Thomas to come in. The inside was just like he remembered it. There was just enough room to lie down. The floor was dirt, and the air was heavy and closed in, making it hard to breathe. There was no furniture, just a bucket for basic needs and a jug of water that would be filled up every day. The small ventilation opening let in light, but it wasn't strong enough to really light up the room. This made it look like it was always twilight, which made it hard to tell the difference between day and night. Joshua held Thomas's face in both hands and made him look him in the eye. He then talked about how this would be the most important moment of his life and how he would come out changed and truly free. The door slammed shut with a loud bang, and then the lock clicked from the outside. Thomas stood in the middle of the small room, his eyes having a hard time getting used to the low light as he listened to the footsteps of Joshua, Ezekiel, and Samuel getting farther away. The silence that came after was complete, so deep that he could hear his own heart beating, each beat echoing in his ears like drums in the distance. The first few hours were the hardest on my mind. Thomas tried to keep his mind busy by looking at every part of the building he had built himself, looking for a weak spot or an escape route that he might have accidentally made. But the job was done exactly as Joshua wanted it to be done. The walls were strong, the boards fit together perfectly with no gaps, and the door was reinforced in a way that made it impossible to open from the inside without tools he didn't have. Before night fell on the first day, he started to feel hungry. He knew that this feeling would only get worse in the days to come. He only had the water jug to eat from, so he carefully measured out each sip, knowing he would need to make it last until someone came to fill it up again. In that dark space, time began to lose its meaning. Each minute seemed to last forever, and all he could do was think. And the more he thought about his situation, the worse he felt. During the night, sounds started to get through the walls. The strange chants Thomas had heard before were the same, but now they were much closer and clearly coming from the other buildings nearby. He became more and more terrified as he realized that he wasn't alone in that triangle of confinement. The other 2 cabins were also occupied, and everyone was going through the same thing at the same time. The voices singing sounded like they were out of control, like the people inside had lost control of their own vocal cords and were making sounds that were more like animal moans than words. Thomas put his hands over his ears to block out the disturbing sounds, but they got through anyway and got into his head even when he tried to think about other things. The chanting went on for hours. At times, it faded to almost inaudible murmurs, and at other times it got louder and turned into screams that shook the wooden walls. He couldn't tell if there were two or more people, if they were men or women, or if they knew what they were doing, or were completely lost in some altered state of consciousness brought on by days of fasting and being alone. When the chanting stopped and was replaced by an even more oppressive silence, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, disturbing images came to mind. Bits of conversations he had heard on the farm, people's faces, and small things that seemed unimportant at the time, but now fit together to form a scary picture of what was really going on in that remote mountain area. On the second day, he felt weak and couldn't even stand up. Thomas spent most of his time lying on the dirt floor, watching the small square of light that came in through the ventilation opening slowly move across the wall opposite him. This marked the passage of time in a way that was both comforting and torturous. His thoughts started to drift in ways he couldn't control. Memories of his life before the farm, mixed with new hallucinations that were starting to happen because he was hungry and not getting enough sensory input. He heard the door of one of the other cabins open late on the second night. There were voices, including Joshua's, that Thomas couldn't understand because they were so low. Then he heard someone being pulled out, their feet scraping on the ground, and then there were weak struggles and protests that didn't make sense and were quickly silenced. The footsteps faded into the woods, and more than one pair of heavy boots carried something or someone farther and farther away until there was no sound at all. Thomas was filled with fear. What happened to the person who was taken out of that cabin? Were they being taken back after their retreat, or had something worse happened? What would happen to that person if they somehow failed Joshua's spiritual test and ended up in the depths of the forest where only the Ward brothers ever went? On the third day, the delusions got worse. Thomas started to see shadows moving in the corner of his vision. These shapes would disappear when he tried to look at them directly. Voices whispered things he couldn't understand, languages that sounded old and strange. He knew logically that they were just things his hungry, lonely mind made up, but that didn't make them any less real or scary. During one of these particularly vivid hallucinations, Thomas believed he saw Martha standing in a corner of the cabin, her face even paler than he remembered, her empty eyes fixed on him. It looked like she was trying to say something, but her lips weren't making any noise. He tried to approach her, extending a trembling hand, but the apparition dissolved into thin air before he could touch her, leaving him alone again in the oppressive gloom. It was during the fourth day that Thomas heard something that momentarily pulled him from his delirious state. It was footsteps coming closer, but not the heavy sound of Ezekiel's or Samuel's boots. These were softer and more careful, like someone trying to sneak through the woods. He heard footsteps stop near his cabin, and then a woman's voice came through so softly that he almost thought it was another hallucination. It was one of the sisters from the kitchen, the same one who had tried to warn him in the barn weeks before. Through a small space between the boards that Thomas hadn't seen before, she whispered quickly. Her words were urgent and broken. She talked about how she had been able to avoid being watched for a few minutes and how being there was very dangerous. She also said that she needed to tell the truth that everyone on the farm knew, but no one else would say. She said that the retreat structures were not meant to help people get closer to God. They were meant to completely break down their minds. Joshua broke people's wills by isolating them, depriving them of their senses and starving them. Then he rebuilt them in his own image. Some, like Silas, came out as obedient shells, while others did not come out at all. Their fates were never explained, but dark rumors spread among those who stayed. She said she had to go before she was found, but she gave Thomas one last warning. If he wanted to keep any part of himself that was still intact, he had to find a way to mentally resist Joshua's methods. No matter what happened in the next few days, he needed to keep some part of himself separate. Once that core essence was gone, there was no going back, no recovery. only an empty life following orders from others without ever questioning or thinking for himself again. The footsteps went away quickly, leaving Thomas alone with her words ringing in his ears. He was thankful for the warning, but he was also more hopeless than ever, because he now knew for sure that his worst fears were true. He wasn't imagining how bad things were, and that knowledge made every extra minute in that confinement even worse. On the fourth night, a storm hit. Thomas could hear thunder coming from far away, feel the air get charged with static electricity, and then the rain started. At first, it was just a few drops hitting the roof, but then it turned into a full-blown deluge that made the outside world sound like it was falling water. The small hole for ventilation let some rain in, which made a puddle in the corner of the cabin that grew over time. During this storm, Thomas made a choice. He wouldn't let Joshua break him. No matter how many days he stayed there, he wouldn't give up completely. He started using mental tricks he had learned years before, like focusing on specific memories from his past life, silently reciting poems he had learned as a child, or anything else that would keep his mind busy and away from what was happening right now. After the storm the night before, the fifth day started with a strange silence. When Thomas woke up, every bone in his body hurt. The weakness was so bad that even sitting down was a huge effort. The rainwater that had come in through the ventilation opening had turned the dirt floor into cold mud, and his clothes were wet, which made him shiver uncontrollably even though the heat was starting to build in the small space as the sun rose. Joshua finally came back on this day. Thomas could hear his footsteps getting closer in that unmistakable, deliberate rhythm, and then he heard the sound of the lock being opened. When the door opened, the light that came in was so bright that Thomas had to cover his eyes. He had been in the dark for days. Joshua stood in the doorway, his dark figure against the bright sky, looking at the carpenter's worsening condition with an unreadable look on his face. The patriarch walked into the cabin, bringing with him the smell of fresh air and pine trees, which was very different from the smell of being trapped that had built up in the space. He knelt next to Thomas and started to talk in a low, almost soft voice. This was such a big change from how he had been talking before that it was unsettling. He talked about how this process was necessary, how everyone had to be broken down before they could be rebuilt correctly, and how fighting it would only make the suffering last longer. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice came out as a hoarse croak, and the words got mixed up on his dry, swollen tongue. Joshua offered him water, holding the pitcher to his lips with almost fatherly care, and letting him take small sips so he wouldn't get sick. It was a planned act of kindness. Even when he was weak, Thomas saw this as a way to make someone emotionally dependent at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. The patriarch stayed there for about an hour, talking non-stop about his vision for the community and how Thomas could become one of the leaders under his guidance. But first he needed to make this important change. He said that the next 2 days would be the most important because that's when the real change would happen, and the last bits of resistance would go away. His words were hypnotic, repetitive, and meant to get past mental defenses that were already weak. When Joshua finally left and locked the door again, Thomas realized something disturbing. Part of him had started to respond to the patriarch's kindness and feel a strange sense of gratitude for the water and the people after being alone for days. He knew this was manipulation. He understood what was going on in his mind, but that didn't stop him from feeling the way he did. This is how Joshua broke people. He would go from complete lack of care to small acts of kindness that made the victims think that their survival and well-being depended on his approval. The 6th day went by in a mental haze. Thomas went in and out of sleep in something that wasn't quite sleep but also wasn't full consciousness. His brain started making up strange stories that he didn't know, but that seemed to have deep meaning. He had imaginary conversations with people he wasn't sure were real, or just figments of his hungry brain trying to keep itself busy. On the sixth night, Thomas had a vision or hallucination that was so clear that he could only describe it as such. He was walking through the woods behind the farm, following a path that shone with its own light in the dark. The path took him to a clearing where he saw everyone from the Ward farm standing in a circle. Their faces were blank, as if someone had purposely erased their features. Joshua was in the middle of the circle, but he wasn't a person. He was not like anyone else. He was an oppressive force that took on a vaguely human form to interact with the world. Thomas woke up from this dream screaming, or at least trying to scream, but his voice had turned into a harsh whisper. It took him a few minutes to get his bearings again, to remember where he was and why, and even then the line between what he had dreamed and what was real seemed very thin. He started to doubt his own memories and perceptions that had seemed solid before. He realized with terror that he was in the exact state that Joshua wanted him to be in, flexible and unsure, ready to accept any story that was offered to him as a lifeline in a sea of confusion. Thomas made a desperate choice at this moment of temporary clarity. With the last of his strength, he started to scratch marks into the wooden walls with his fingernails. These were small symbols that stood for things he knew to be true about himself before he got to the farm. Like his real name, not the name Joshua used, where he was born, and the names of his missing family. Making each mark hurt because his nails broke against the hard wood, but he kept going, making a physical map of identity that he hoped would help him stay grounded when Joshua came back on the seventh day to finish what he had started. The seventh day came, and everything was eerily quiet. Thomas woke up feeling like he was looking at himself from a distance, as if he were not really in his own body. He was no longer in acute pain from hunger. Instead, he felt numb all the time. His mind drifted in and out of altered states of consciousness that made it hard to tell real thoughts from illusions that came from being locked up for a long time. During the early morning hours, he traced with his fingers the marks he had made on the wall during the night, trying to use those symbols as an anchor to the reality that existed before the Ward farm. But even those marks began to seem strange, as if they had been made by someone else, and he questioned whether the memories they represented were genuine or constructs his mind had fabricated to protect him from the truth, that he had always been part of that dark place in the mountains. The sounds came back around noon, but they weren't the scary chants from the night before. Instead, they were low voices talking to each other so close that Thomas could hear the murmur of voices but not make out any words. He put his ear up to the wall to hear something that made sense, something that showed him what was going on in the world outside of his cell. Then, without a doubt, the door to the cabin next door opened. Thomas heard Joshua's voice change to that soft, manipulative tone that he now knew meant that a new stage of psychological control was about to begin. There was a weak response, and the words were so jumbled that they could have come from anyone in any situation. Then, footsteps, many pairs, slowly faded away until the silence came back, thicker than before. Thomas waited, each minute seeming like hours, knowing that it would be his turn soon. He tried to get ready mentally by silently saying the things he knew were true and building up walls inside himself to keep Joshua from getting in. But he couldn't keep his thoughts straight because he was so weak, and he could feel his defenses falling apart even as he tried to raise them. Thomas closed his eyes against the light he knew would come when the latch on his door finally moved. Joshua and Samuel came in together. They both looked at the carpenter's poor condition with a mix of satisfaction and what could be seen as professional concern. The patriarch knelt down next to Thomas again, and his presence made the small space feel even more cramped. Joshua's words were carefully chosen, with each one meant to get past weak mental defenses. He talked about renewal and how Thomas had gone through the fire of purification and was now ready to come out changed. He painted pictures of a future in the community where Thomas would be valued, respected, and a part of something bigger than himself. He painted pictures of purpose and belonging that were very appealing to someone who had been alone for 7 days. Thomas felt like a part of him was responding to the words, wanting to believe and accept the story being told. The only other option was to keep resisting without knowing how much longer he could do so. Still, there was a strong core inside him that saw through the manipulation and wouldn't give in completely, even though it was small and fragile. Joshua must have felt this last bit of resistance because his tone changed slightly. He started to talk about what would happen if they didn't give up completely. He said that those who kept fighting only made their suffering last longer and eventually broke, but in much worse ways. These weren't direct threats, but hints that were maybe even more powerful because they weren't clear. Samuel didn't say anything during this conversation, but his presence made Joshua's words more powerful. He looked at Thomas with those calculating eyes, judging each reaction and micro-expression. He probably made mental notes of strategies he could use if this first phase of reintegration didn't go as planned. In the end, Joshua helped Thomas get up, or, more accurately, Samuel helped him get up, while Joshua kept talking to him in a soothing voice. They took him out of the cabin, and the sunlight was so bright that Thomas had to keep his eyes closed. He let them lead him back to the main farm along the trail. After 7 days of breathing the same stale air, the fresh air was almost intoxicating, and he felt dizzy enough that the world spun even with his eyes closed. The walk back felt like it would never end, and each step took a lot of focus and work. Thomas could hear faint sounds coming from the farm that was getting closer. He could hear people talking, tools being used, and animals moving around in the pastures. They were sounds of everyday life going on, not caring what had happened to him in those remote buildings in the woods. When they got to the main house, Thomas was taken to a room he had never seen before. It was small but nice, with a real bed instead of just a thin mattress on the floor. Joshua said that this would be his room while he recovered. He would spend the next few days resting and getting his physical strength back, while Joshua helped him spiritually reintegrate into the community. They finally left him alone, and Thomas fell onto the bed, his body grateful for the softness after days on the hard floor. But his mind was still racing as it tried to make sense of everything that had happened and figure out how much of himself was still the same, and how much had changed after 7 days of being alone. He touched the marks left by his broken fingernails, which were physical reminders of what he had been through. He wondered if he could keep that core of resistance that was still weakly pulsing inside him, or if he would eventually be completely absorbed by the distorted reality that Joshua had built in that forgotten place in the Appalachian Mountains, like Silas and others before him. The next few days were a blur of getting better physically and being bombarded mentally all the time. Thomas stayed in the special room and got small but regular meals that his small stomach could barely handle. Joshua came by several times a day, always bringing his private sermons and always trying to change the carpenter's view of reality to fit his own warped view. During these sessions, Joshua used tricks he had learned over the years to get people to do what he wanted. He switched between being kind and distant, which made Thomas feel unsure of his feelings and always want to please him. He asked Thomas what he thought while he was alone, and then used the answers to show that every doubt and fear was a sign of spiritual weakness that could only be overcome by giving in completely. Thomas found that pretending to agree was easier than being open about his disagreement. He learned how to make the right sounds and use facial expressions that Joshua saw as signs of real change. It was a desperate act, trying to keep up the appearance of conversion while hiding something of himself deep in his mind, where Joshua couldn't get to it. But every day that core essence felt more fragile and far away, like a memory that fades over time. During this time, Martha came by once with food on a tray and hands that were clearly shaking. She didn't look directly at Thomas. She always kept her eyes on the floor, But when she put down the tray and turned to leave, he saw something in her profile that made him very sad. She was completely broken, like a robot, doing things without any will of her own, and Thomas saw in her the future that Joshua had planned for him. Joshua finally said that Thomas was ready to go back to doing normal things in the community. He was taken back to morning prayers, where the other members looked at him with a mix of relief that it wasn't them and morbid curiosity about how much of him had survived. Silas was there, still moving like a shadow of the person he used to be. Thomas felt a horrible connection to him because they were both living in a liminal space between real life and just existing. Work started up again, but Thomas couldn't get lost in his work like he used to. Ezekiel, or Samuel, who always seemed to be nearby, watched every move, weighed every word, and judged every facial expression. He was so afraid that the Ward brothers could read even his most private thoughts that he started to watch himself and censor his thoughts before they were even fully formed. Thomas saw something strange at the edge of the property one afternoon while he was working in the fields. He saw new tracks of disturbed ground in a part of the woods he didn't remember seeing before. He tried not to look directly at it or show interest, but he couldn't get it out of his head. How many of these tracks have there been over the years? How many people had come to the Ward farm and never left? Only Joshua and his brothers knew what had happened to them. Thomas pushed the question deep into his mind, where he kept all the other truths that made life bearable only by refusing to think about them. He was too scared to think about it fully. He concentrated on the work and the repetitive motions that didn't require any thought. This let him enter the state of numbness that he saw in the other older members of the community. But the questions came back at night when he was in bed. How long could he keep up this level of performance? How long did it take Joshua to realize that the change wasn't finished? When that time came, what would happen next? Would they go back into the forest structures, or would they do something more permanent? Thomas didn't know what to do. He was only getting more scared and felt like time was running out. He felt like a terrible resolution was coming, like a storm in the distance that he could see but not hear. Months passed, and autumn began to paint the Appalachian mountains in shades of red and gold. The Ward farm stayed alone, a closed-off world where time seemed to work differently than it did in the rest of North Carolina. Thomas had become just another shadow among the shadows, doing chores, taking part in endless prayers, and keeping up the mask of submission that he had learned was necessary for survival. But the community itself was starting to change in some way. Martha had retreated completely to her quarters, rarely seen even during meals. The women in the kitchen whispered concerns that were quickly silenced whenever any of the Ward siblings approached. There was a growing tension in the air, as if the farm itself were holding its breath, awaiting some event that everyone felt was approaching but no one could name. Joshua preached more and more, talking more and more about the trials that were to come and how the community would need to show even more faith in the months to come. His eyes had acquired a feverish quality, and his words came in torrents that lasted for hours, obsessively repeating the same themes until they lost all meaning and became just sounds filling the chapel space. Something amazing happened during one of these long sermons. Martha stood in the chapel doorway, and the light from the windows made her weak body look even weaker. She said nothing, simply stood there, and her mere presence was enough to make Joshua interrupt his sermon for the first time Thomas could remember. The silence that followed was dense with unspoken meanings, with years of secrets and traumas shared only between husband and wife. Joshua left the pulpit and walked over to Martha. His face showed a range of emotions that Thomas had never seen before. They could have been real worry or fear. He gently led her out of the chapel, and the other members of the congregation remained seated in absolute silence, no one daring to move or speak until Ezekiel eventually dismissed them with a brusque gesture of his hand. That night, the farm was filled with strange sounds. They weren't the disturbing chants that had become common. They were voices raised in discussion, or maybe even mourning. Thomas lay in bed and listened through the thin walls. He wondered if something in the rigid structure Joshua had built was finally starting to break. In the days that followed, there were small but noticeable changes. Prayers were shorter, meals were less formal, and there were times when people weren't always on guard like they used to be. Thomas saw that other people in the community were giving each other meaningful looks and not saying anything, which made him think that something was being planned or at least thought about. It was Silas, of all people, who made the first real move toward change. One morning, while he was working in the field, he just stopped, dropped his tools, and started walking toward the road that led off the property. He didn't run away or hide. He walked with a purpose that made it seem like he was finally going to do something he had been thinking about for a long time. Ezekiel saw him and started to follow him, but Samuel suddenly put a hand on his brother's arm and stopped him. They looked at each other for a long time, and some understanding passed between them. Then they both went back to work as if nothing had happened. Silas kept walking, and his figure got smaller and smaller until it was gone around the bend in the road, where trees surrounded it. At that moment, something very important broke at Ward Farm. In the days that followed, more people left. First, the three sisters from the kitchen left together at dawn. After that, the Blackwells came with small bags of their things. People who had been kept there for years out of fear and mind games just walked away, one by one or in small groups, and no one stopped them. During this slow exodus, Joshua only came out of his room once. He stood on the porch of the main house watching people leave. His face was a mask of complicated feelings that Thomas couldn't understand. There were no threats, attempts to persuade, or sermons about betrayal. It was like the patriarch had finally realized that the total power he had held for so long had disappeared, like morning mist that the rising sun burned away. Thomas waited a few more days, watching and trying to figure out if that freedom was real or just another complicated test by Joshua. But in the end, he realized that he might never be completely sure, and that waiting would only make his time there longer. So he packed up his few things and started walking down the road. No one stopped him or said anything as he walked past the main house, where Joshua and Martha were still inside, dealing with the loss of everything they had worked for. Thomas just walked away from the Ward farm, the creepy buildings in the woods, and all the secrets that place held, one step at a time. The Appalachian mountains surrounded him as he drove down the dirt road. The forest closed in on him, but now it seemed less scary and more like protection. It finally hit him from the place where prayers had turned into something much worse. Ward's farm would stay in the mountains of North Carolina, and over time, the stories about it would fade into whispers among the locals. They would tell tales on winter nights about the strange place where a man tried to make his own world with rules that went against both morality and reason. But for those who had lived there, who had survived the trials and finally found the courage to leave, the farm would always be a reminder of how easily faith can be twisted into a tool of control, and how important it is to always keep that core of identity that no outside force should be able to touch. If this trip through the dark parts of Ward Farm moved you in any way, please think about subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with your thoughts. Until the next tale.